we were becoming, we were living and walking and talking, flying, and we were comparing, with each other. We were, what troubles are you having, and how are you doing, and we were checking like our gunnery scores. And a couple of funny stories on that. I think the instructors used to draw straws to see who was going to be the unfortunate guy that had to fly the tow plane. They had a big heavy rope with a big sock on it about 10, 12 feet long, about 3 or 4 feet around diameter. And when you go up for gunnery runs, there were all sorts of things that we had to, were new to us, things we had to learn, like the gun switches in the airplane and the red switches that they had there, and you had to respect those things. We had a few cases where cadets would start up their SNJ and get all ready to taxi off, and they'd pull back on the stick as you're, keep your stick back when you're taxiing, and they'd accidentally hit the gun switch. And every once in a while you'd hear some 50s go off, and of course immediately the cadet realized what he had done, and the gun switches were on, and this was a real no-no. And when you had done this, and what you had to do then was stop your airplane from your taxi and turn around, go on back, put your plane back in line, turn off the engine, get out of the plane, and walk over, because they could hear it and could see it, and they knew who you were. And so the rest of that day, what you do is carry around on your shoulder a 50 caliber machine gun. This was your penalty for being such a stoop and being a Dilbert and not realizing that you had your gun switches on. And it really was very effective, because a 50 caliber machine gun is a very, very heavy piece of equipment. And wherever you would go that day, to all your classes, you had to carry that 50 caliber machine gun and then lay it down outside your classroom. And of course, it wasn't exactly very clean, so you had to run down the washroom, get your hands clean, get back into class on time. And then we also had, talking about those kind of arrows, we also had the fellows that were making various mistakes. Some guys would be coming in from a flight, they'd peel off, they'd been up in with a formation and doing either navigation or dive bombing or gunnery runs, whatever you're doing that day, probably some tight formation flying or fighter tactics. And some of the cadets would come in, and your regular procedure when you would peel off, and you'd be about 300-400 yards apart, and you're coming in downwind now, and you're getting ready to land. So as you go, you're coming downwind of the strip, and we're back on strips again. No more of that tarmac stuff up at like we had at primary. And so you go through your regular landing procedure. You open your hood, put down your goggles, and put your prop into low pitch, put your mixture into rich, and put on your auxiliary fuel pump, put your gas tank over the main, and lower your flaps, and then lower your wheels. Make sure your tail wheel is locked. And so as you're coming in, if you should forget your wheels, when you put the plane, when you retire the throttle back to idle, like when you're getting ready to, as you're just about getting ready to touch down, as you're on your final approach, you throttle back your engine. And as you do, the horn's going to blow if you don't have your wheels down. So there's one particular story that was funnier than heck. We had quite a few planes do this. And what would happen was, this fellow was coming in on a flight, and he didn't have his wheels down, and so the tower puts the red light. They have a beacon light they shine right at you. It's red, and that whenever you get that in your cockpit, you know something's wrong on the strip or whatever it is. It means you abort your landing and you go around. And you also have your radio, and you're tuned into the frequency at the tower, and the tower is hollering at this guy to get his wheels down and to abort the landing, take a wave off, take a wave off. And they're screaming at him over the horn, and we can, everybody can hear it. And so they're screaming at him over the radio to get his wheels down, and nope, he comes right in and lands wheels up and washes out the airplane. The crash crews come out there. He's all right. They pull him out and they get him in. The instructor is madder than hell. He said, "What is the matter with you?" He said, I was up in the tower and I was screaming at you to get your wheels down. We had the ferry pistol. We shot you a red flare. And what in the world, why couldn't you hear me? What was the matter? Didn't you have your radio on? Oh, yes, sir. He says, the horn was making so much noise I couldn't hear you. The instructor just looked at the guy. They didn't wash him out, but he had to do a lot of extra duty, and he always had to do that. And one of the extra duty things was to work at night in the hangar with the mechanics, and anything they had to do with changing tires or anything had to do with the landing gear, you would be out there for 4 hours every night. I think it was for a whole week you had to do this. Plus the fact you had to take the wheel, and you had the wheel, not from that airplane, but the one wheel in the hangar someplace, and you had to wheel that wheel around with you to all your classes. The same thing would happen with fellows that forgot to land with if they wouldn't put their flaps down. They'd have to walk around with a piece of the flap. So every once in a while you see a guy either with a machine gun or a wheel or a flap, and these guys were real dunces. And but it did happen. It did happen. But anyway, on this gunnery run thing, it's that tow line was a couple 300 yards long, so you could see why the instructors were scared to death, because here's a bunch of cadets diving down on them, and usually would do this in flights of 6, and you each had a different colored ammo. The heads of your particular round were colored either red or green or blue or yellow, so that when you hit the tow target sleeve, they could mark it and just say, okay, there's so many green holes, there's so many red holes, and there's a couple yellow holes, and you were graded on this, and of course graded very closely. And it was an integral part of becoming a pilot that you get a good gunnery score. And it was a very, very difficult, of all the things we did, I think gunnery proved to be the most difficult for a lot of pilots. Between navigation and gunnery, I think those are the two things that took the biggest toll. And in gunnery, it got to be some pretty tragic things where we had cadets who would actually fly into the sleeve itself and crash, and some of them fly in and break and cut the rope. Sometimes they got out of it, and sometimes they didn't. We even had a case, or one, not in our flight, but we had a case on one of the fields where a cadet actually overshot the sleeve. He was so interested in what you call target fascination that he just kept shooting and shooting and shooting, and he went and he crashed right into the tow plane. The instructor got out, but the cadet didn't. And so it was a very learning experience and a very serious thing. But you either had to feel, it's like in hunting when you're shooting at anything with a moving target, you always have to lead it. And this was showing up in gunnery with an awful lot of cadets. They just couldn't get the feel of leading it. They wanted to aim right at the sleeve, and of course, by the time they pull the trigger on your stick, well, hell, the shot's going to go way, way, way behind. And so you had to learn how to. Of course, you had to fly it very smoothly. You had to keep your needle ball. You had to keep your plane in it, just so you couldn't be in any kind of a skid or a yaw. And you had to become part of that airplane, and you had to actually feel feel it going right in. You had to feel right about it. So you soon learned that, you had to lead this thing by a number of feet, like 30, 40, 50 feet, depending upon your speed and the angle of your dive and your distance to the target. And it was either it's more of a natural thing that you learn and to anticipate. You have to lead it. And it was just there was a lot of cadets taking extra hours on this, a lot of boasting. Some guy go up and pat you on the back and say, "Hey, that was a real sharp flight, Hawk. What you doing?" The next day you'd go and tap and say, "Hey, that was a damn good thing that you did over there, buddy," and it was your turn. And you never saw anybody boasting or bragging. It was because you knew that you had a good day today, but maybe tomorrow wouldn't be so good, and maybe the other guy would be better. But you always try to do the best you could. But boy, gunnery was a real tough one for a lot of kids. And the gunnery runs would consist of coming in at the same altitude as the tow plane, and then just firing a full deflection shot. So that you had a 90-degree lead, and there you had to lead a lot, and that was the toughest thing to do because you'd have yourself led so far that when you pulled the trigger, you weren't that far back from the tow plane. But that's the way you had to do it, on a very full deflection. So we'd do high side full deflection, low side, high side runs. It was just a real neat. It was just a lot of fun doing that, and it was a lot of fun to see how good you could keep your scores up and how you could try to better. You're actually in competition with yourself, like in so many things, and so you're always trying to do better and do better, and it was just I enjoyed it so very, very much. But like I say, we did have a lot of problems with it. So then in the dancer also we got up into doing what they call dive bombing, but it was actually at a glide angle. We'd get them over as steep as we could, and we had little magnesium bombs, and we had a target down on the ground. We'd fly out to an area, and then we'd peel off and dive down on this thing and see how good you could get a little puff. They were full of a white powder, like a chalk, and so when you'd hit, you could tell right away where your hit was. And there we'd use different colors of these. Actually, what it was a 12, something like a 12 gauge shotgun shell. So when it would hit, it would explode, and then you'd get that white or green or red, and you could see how close you got. And so we were marked very closely on that. Advanced was like the word implies. I mean, now you're getting enough hours of flying, and you're beginning to understand that there are old pilots and bold pilots, but you don't have any old bold pilots, and you're beginning to see the limitations. We would go up, and we would also spin the plane more for the idea of trying to develop your flying technique by coming out exactly right. Like in primary, when we'd spin, we'd come right out on the road, and wouldn't take too much training, to be able to do that good. But the higher the performance of the plane, and the higher the wing loading, the more you had to lead it again. So that if you're spinning and you want to come out, you'd anticipate coming out about 3/4 of the way through the turn. You'd neutralize, you'd opposite your controls, so that by the time that you did come around the other 3/4 of the turn, you'd be coming out just right. Kind of hard to explain, but it was all a case of getting familiar with your airplane, becoming a better pilot, becoming more accurate, making good landings, not bouncing anymore, and coming in real smooth and taking off smooth. Everything that you were doing. Joining up was another thing that was hard for a lot of cadets. Instructors would try to say, look at it, at a 45-degree angle. When you take off and your instructor your plane you're going to join up on is out there to your left, and he's flying, you've got to increase your speed a little bit, not a lot, but then you have to turn and anticipate. And if you figure everything on a 45-degree angle, you can slide right up in there with hardly any additional power. But when you see a guy that gets sucked back, then he has to pull himself up into a position on his throttle, he actually hasn't learned it yet. And we had a lot of problems with cadets learning how to anticipate, how to lead, just like in gunnery. The same thing now with joining up on a plane. You have to lead and just slide in there real nice. So it's a case of where you either felt it or you didn't, and if you didn't do it, you had to learn it mechanically, and it comes to you. But later on, when you got into higher performance airplanes, it was even more important that you join up. And especially, there was a great deal of pride taken with it too. Then, if your flight could join up in 90 degrees in X amount of minutes from the time you took off, and you're all tucked up in there real neat. And by this time, we're learning how to fly 3, 4, 5, 6 feet apart and do it very comfortably. Night flying, formation night flying. And we're doing a little bit of formation dive bombing at night. We'd split up and then dive down and join up. And it's actually easier to fly close at night because you can fly off the exhaust stacks, the light from the exhaust stacks, and the further away you get, the darker it gets. So the closer in you get, it's actually easier. Of course, today's with jets that wouldn't apply, but the other part of advance that was giving, in fact, I had some problems with that too, and that was instrument flying. Was the idea of getting under the hood. In that case, the instructor would be in the front and you'd be in the back, and they'd cover you up with a hood, and you'd go up and they'd do simple maneuvers at first, left and right turns and climb and dive and climb and glide and climb, and then they'd start to put you into, we had regular navigational patterns that we had that would put on our instrument panel, and you'd say, okay, execute plan C, and then you look for your plan C, and you turn the page, and okay, you had that one in front of you. So you'd fly that sequence. And it probably had 6 or 8 turns and 7 or 8 different changes of altitude. And you'd start sweating under there because, they were grading you very closely, and you had to watch your altitude and watch your turns, and it's such an easy way to get vertigo. And you had to be, when you'd see the airspeed going up, you knew that you were diving, and you had to pull back on the stick, and it's a whole new world. And unless you've done instrument flying, it's hard to explain it. But many times they could take you under the hood and get you upside down. You didn't even know it. Hard to explain, hard to believe, but we had many hours of, I don't forget exactly how many hours we put in instrument flying, but it sure did pay off because it gave you so much confidence in being able to fly these patterns. We had about 4 or 5 patterns that they would have us fly, and you were so busy there that when you got out in those flights, you were actually sweating. And of course now I think I failed to mention too, we do our gear. Of course now we're all in flight suits now, and we've got our little flight overalls, and those things would be sopping wet for me after an instrument flight, because that was really a sweater. And some of these programs that go for, you'd be under the hood, say 45 to 55 minutes, flying some of these patterns that were laid out. These are the same patterns, much like the airline pilots have now when they're coming into a city, and they have to go on instruments and they have to follow a particular course, and then you can tell when you're on course and off course because you have a beam. And in some of these patterns that we're flying, you'd have the beam, and you could tell by the sound of the beam if you got a dot dash, you're on the left. You got a dash dot, you're on the right. So you could differentiate, whether you were left of where you should be, or if you were right of where you should be. So if you veered off, you get a dash dot, you knew it to the right. So you could pull it back, and then you get on a steady beam again. And then if you got a dot dash, you're drifting to the left. So all this is going on in your ears, and you're watching your compass, and you're watching your airspeed, and you're still trying to fly this pattern, and you're supposed to fly at exactly a certain speed, and you're supposed to be at exact altitudes when you're doing all this. So it was a difficult thing. Instrument flying was hard for me, and it was hard for a lot of us. It wasn't a natural thing because you can't see anything. All you're doing is just flying by those instruments. So that was a learning experience, and very good, and we learned a lot. And then I think I failed to mention too, back at primary, we had the hottest rock in the world coming into the auditorium. We were all brought in there, and here comes out this classy guy and his marine greens and his Sam Brown belt, and this guy's a major, and God, he had to be right next to God as far as I was concerned. So he made the announcement that we were just boot-ass cadets starting in our middle school, and that if you can qualify, the Marine Corps will be looking for pilots, and you will be advised of this when you get further on down the line. And we're not taking anyone's name or applications now, but they will when you get to advanced. They'll be looking at your records for those that you apply, and there will be somewhere between 5 and 10% of the top part of the class that we are interested in, and that so keep that in mind, you cadets that are thinking about or would like to try to qualify to become, try to get into marine aviation. So anyway, up to updated, we had another meeting in the auditorium with all the cadets, and these two Marine pilots were up there, and they said that they're going to take the top 6% of the class, any of those in the top 6 that feel that they would like to qualify for marine aviation. At the end of the lecture can contact me here at the stage, and then I'll give you some more details. So when the thing broke up, I had to, of course, I went flashing up there, and there was quite a few of us guys that wanted to get into that. And then they set up interview times for us. And so we gave them our name and our class number and all our pertinent information on us. And then they were going to check our ground school records and our flight records, because every flight you take, you'd be graded on, and not just up check or down check, but you got a grade. When you got an up check, you got a grade, anything from a 2.5 to a 4 point, and so the higher the grades, of course, the better your scores. So I got into that. I got a call. I had a message at the room that I was supposed to contact a captain so-and-so, and it was on my duty off hour, so I went racing over there, and he wanted to know why I wanted to get into marine aviation, what I'd heard about it, if I had ever had any relatives in the Marines, and he went through the whole program why we wanted to get in. And so I had a lot of fun with that, because I was telling you, ever since about 9 years old, I've been sitting on those planes up at Minneapolis, and I always thought that the Marine pilots were absolutely the best. And he's kind of smiling a little bit, and so he said, "Well, it just isn't a decision you made just lately, then." And I said, "Oh no," I said, "this has been on my mind, all my life, ever since I've been a little kid in my bike out there." So he was a pretty nice guy. He was from Vermont, and had a neat little twang to his voice, and so he said, "I'll be reviewing your records, and then I'll be calling for you when I have done that, and good luck and everything else." And So I'm saluting and flashing around there, and about 2 weeks later I got another message to come and see him, and he said that your ground school records are adequate. And I thought, they were pretty damn good. 3.75, I think it was something. So, and he said your flight records are fine, and your ground school's okay. So he said we'll be talking again. He said there's going to be 17 of you who we'll be talking to. So they had arranged that meeting, and when we got to that meeting, they were more explicit about what they wanted us to do, and be sure that we didn't, incur any demerits, or that we didn't incur any extra time, or that we didn't get any bad grades, and to keep everything right up there. And gave us a couple of manuals that we had to look over. Of course, we had all kinds of books in advance. We had engineering books and navigation books and naval history books, and now on top of that we had Marine Corps history books, and so there was a lot of studying going on, but still a lot of time that that we could play. As I mentioned, those little gals up at the university there, that we finally got out of Pensacola itself and all the Barracudas, and so we had a good time because the gals at school would usually have Daddy's car, and that way we could go out and tear around and go to dances, and they could bring us back to the base, and that worked out pretty good. Good. One thing I haven't mentioned either is that, for a little small town, little Minnesota boy to be ended up down in Florida, and I just couldn't get over, the difference in the palm trees and how big and expansive everything was, and how nice and comfortable it was. It wasn't cold, and it wasn't windy, and it was the first time in my life that I've ever been down south. I've been out, to the West Coast many, many, many times, but I'd never been down south. And of course, these gals, they all had these little southern accents and little drawls, and all of those guys from North thought that was pretty cute. We thought that was kind of nice, and so we used to have a lot of real good times together. And I think the gals were enjoying the cadets there as much as we were enjoying the girls. And it was, like I say, it was just a fabulous experience all the way through, doing the thing that you've always wanted to do, fly. And another thing that they wanted to do now, we're pretty well getting along in advance, so all we got to do now is we've been out practicing touch and go landings and preparing to do carrier landings, and they got the old Langley out there, and we're supposed to shoot 6 landings and takeoffs on that, but the program is getting to the point now where they only want to have us make 3 landings and takeoffs. And of course that could be an entire book on itself, but we went through films, a lot of very intensive training about how to fly the airplane, 2 and 3 knots above stalling with a dirty being hood open, wheels down, flaps down, and getting in the groove, learning with landing signal officer, which we learned it was an LSO, and the landing signal officer's got his paddles, and when he has one arm down, that means your wing is down. You bring it up, and when you're slow, he's got his paddles up, and come on, a little more speed. And you learn that all these movements he makes and the way he makes them is telling you a story. If he's frantic with those paddles, it means you're very slow. If he's way down with a paddle, it means you're way off on your wing. Get your wing up. And if you're coming in too high, he's got his paddles up. He wants you down, and you can tell by the movement of his paddles. And this is all something you learn after making hundreds and hundreds of passes on a simulated part of the strip that we've chalked it off so it's carrier size. And so we just make hundreds of landings like that, so you got very comfortable flying the airplane 2 and 3 knots above stalling, what to do exactly, so that when the day came that when we flew out, we had a perfect day. We had about 5 knots of wind, if I remember, just a perfect day to go out there and do it. But that damn boat looked like a 2x4 down there. Even after all the practicing you've been doing, when you come in on the real thing, and there's an LSO, and of course this LSO is just like the other one. All the LSOs